All right, well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and thanks very much for the invitation. So, and as Sam said, my most recent book is Slave Empire: How Slavery Built Modern Britain, which is a kind of history of the rise and fall of slavery and of anti-slavery in the British Empire in the 18th and 19th centuries. But my theme today is drawn from the book, and I hope will give you a sense of the kinds of arguments that I make, and hopefully help you to see a classic of English literature within the context of the rise and fall of slavery and anti-slavery in Britain and the British world. So just to begin at the beginning, in post-Brexit Britain, freedom and liberty, right, free trade, the expansion and export of freedom by Britain to the wider world have become watchwords for apologists of the British Empire and a part of the vision of post-Brexit Britain. In the public rhetoric of what it means for Britain to no longer be a part of the European Union, the empire of free trade, the kind of high noon of the Victorian Empire in the 19th century, is often invoked as something that Britain could aspire to again as a model for post-Brexit Britain to emulate. But that word freedom does an awful lot of work, and yet it's often a term that is left unconsidered or undefined. So my aim today is to take you through some of the meanings of freedom in the 18th and 19th century, and to show the ways that the empire built on slavery in the British world in the 18th century carried through to an empire that was officially committed to anti-slavery in the 19th century. And that's one of the central pillars of my new book, Slave Empire, to show the ways that an empire that officially abjured slavery, first by abolishing the British slave trade in 1807, and then by abolishing colonial slavery in 1833, how an empire that was officially anti-slavery nonetheless was in many ways animated by principles and values and structures that were built by slavery itself. And so, in one sense, it's a kind of irrefutable material fact that slavery was a cornerstone of Atlantic trade in the 18th century. And I think even the most passionate apologists for the legacy of the British Empire admit this, right? I don't think anyone argues that Britain was not among the world's most deeply invested slave traders in the 18th century. But it's that moment of abolition that I'm interested in. And so I hope you'll join me today as I try to explain to you some of the ways that the empire of slavery lived on in the empire of anti-slavery. So this slide is an image. It was the frontispiece of a collection of poems published in 1808 called Poems on the Abolition of the Slave Trade. So it was a kind of memorial book, a souvenir volume for British readers who were interested in having a physical memento of the abolition of the slave trade and celebrating Britain's role. And in it, you can see a sentiment that is becoming more and more familiar in discussions of the way people in Britain and in Britain's former colonies ought to remember the relationship between Britain and slavery. So this is the seated figure of Britannia, the personification of Britain and Britishness, offering freedom, giving freedom to a group of naked and or partially clothed enslaved people of African descent, right? This is Britain as the giver of law, Britain as the giver of freedom, Britain inspiring gratitude from its colonial subjects, Britain teaching and educating the formerly enslaved. And the ethos of anti-slavery that is visible in this image is one that is still visible in discussions of the British Empire today. And I hope that you've noticed them, right? Whenever the abolition of slavery is brought up, or often when the abolition of slavery is brought up in British media, it's as an example of British virtue. And this was an idea that the leaders of the British anti-slavery movement at the turn of the 19th century held themselves, they imagined that the abolition of the British slave trade was a moment of profound atonement, that Britain's putative national sacrifice, right? Because for many abolitionists, part of the argument for abolishing the slave trade was a kind of national sacrifice that would eliminate Britain's guilt. So having been a slave trader for 200 years, Britain, by abolishing its slave trade, at a stroke, atoned for its national sins. And that language of sins forgiven and that language of sins forgiven is something that is evident everywhere at the turn of the 19th century. And I want to burrow a little more deeply, though, into the question of whether or not that atonement was actually possible. And I want to do it by looking at a very famous novel, The Life and Strange, Surprising Adventures of Robinson Crusoe of York, Mariner. So this is a very famous story, whether you read it in school, whether you've never read it at all, you're almost certainly familiar with the basic elements of the plot of this novel, first published in 1719 and written by Daniel Defoe. It's the story of a mariner from York of Huguenot extraction who goes to sea and finds himself shipwrecked on a desert island in the Caribbean. And on that desert island, he slowly builds a life for himself and then eventually escapes. And so it's that story, it's that part of the story, that central act of the story, the period when Robinson Crusoe is isolated on the island that most people remember. But the story itself is bracketed by stories of slavery. It's actually a novel told in 3 acts. It's just the middle act is the longest, most memorable, and most famous. So in the first part of the novel, we meet Robinson Crusoe, who goes to sea in the fictional chronology of the novel, in the mid 17th century, or sorry, rather, yeah, in the mid 17th century, and finds himself working on board a slave ship, and then is captured by Barbary corsairs off the coast of North Africa, is enslaved himself in North Africa, escapes, and then goes to Brazil, where he establishes a plantation growing sugar worked by enslaved labor. And it's in the midst of crossing the Atlantic in service of this plantation enterprise that Crusoe is actually shipwrecked in the first place. So Crusoe winds up on his desert island because of his involvement in plantation slavery and in the trade in enslaved Africans. And then in the third act of the novel, after Crusoe himself, after he escapes from his desert island, he returns to Europe, where he discovers that in the 20 years that he's been isolated and alone, and then, as I'll discuss a little bit later, eventually accompanied by his servant Friday, he returns to Portugal and discovers that he's a rich man. He gathers all the dividends of the plantation that he founded and then sells it for an additional profit. So this is both a kind of classic adventure story, but it's also a story that has many of the elements of slavery in the Atlantic world in the 17th and early 18th century. And it's Crusoe's own story of a kind of ambitious young Englishman going to sea, going to the Atlantic, is one that would be familiar to many 18th century people, as would the centrality of slavery to that story. So just to give you a sense of the chronology of the novel, both in terms of the fictional chronology, but also the actual chronology of British and English history at the time. So in the novel, Robinson Crusoe goes to sea in 1651. So he goes to sea at a time when England, because there was no Great Britain yet, the Act of Union had not passed and would not pass until 1707. It was at a time when England's involvement in plantation slavery and in the slave trade was relatively limited. England conquered Jamaica from the Spanish only in 1655 under Cromwell's protectorate. And so Crusoe is shipwrecked very shortly after England, outside of the fictional chronology of the novel, had begun to build an empire based on plantation slavery and on the labor of enslaved people in the Caribbean. But when he escapes from the island in 1686, just 2 years before the Glorious Revolution and the end of the beginning of the end of the Stuart monarchy in England, the position of England and Britain in relationship to slavery had transformed. Throughout the time that Robinson Crusoe was marooned on his island, England's involvement with the slave trade was picking up speed, picking up momentum, and growing in volume. As you can see from this slide, this is taken from the Slave Voyages database, an essential and free online resource for visualizing the scale of the transatlantic slave trade. So you can see here, this graph represents the total number of enslaved people who were brought by force across the Atlantic Ocean on board English and then British slave ships in the course of the period from 1650 to the abolition of the slave trade in 1807. And you can see that the time that Robinson Crusoe was fictionally imprisoned on his island was also a time when English and then British involvement in the slave trade was accelerating. And it was also at a time, and you can see this from the map on the other side of the screen, when Britain's Atlantic Empire was becoming more and more closely and deeply integrated as a single economic unit. And as I argue in Slave Empire, it was an economic unit that was in many ways anchored by the profits of plantation slavery in the Caribbean. So take a far-flung British colony like Newfoundland, now a province of Canada. Newfoundland was, at the time, from the perspective of the British Empire, effectively a cod fishery. It was not permanently settled. Sailors and fishermen would sail from Britain to Newfoundland annually in order to fish cod. And they fished cod in order to salt it and send it to the Caribbean in order to feed enslaved people. So the Atlantic world, Britain's Atlantic Empire, was tilted towards providing energy, money, people, and fuel, foodstuffs to the sugar colonies of the Caribbean. So even as, at the moment when Daniel Defoe was publishing Robinson Crusoe, he was looking at an empire, an Atlantic empire, that was becoming increasingly important to Britain's sense of itself and to British prosperity, and was also becoming increasingly and eventually overwhelmingly centered on the labor of enslaved people. So in one sense, we can look at Robinson Crusoe as a way of understanding Britain's entanglement with slavery in the 17th and 18th centuries. And I think that material history is one that is important to remember. But there's also a history of ideas and ideologies and ideas about what it means to be free that's at work, or that was at work throughout British society in the 18th century, but that is especially visible in Robinson Crusoe. So you can see here, these are 3 images from a 19th century edition of the novel. And they give you a sense, of Robinson Crusoe as explorer, Robinson Crusoe as scholar, and Robinson Crusoe as master of the indigenous man whom he names Friday, who is also shipwrecked on the island, and whom Crusoe, and this is actually in my own edition of the book, which is the Oxford World Classics edition, it's actually the Poe quote on the back of the book, which is, "I made him know his name should be Friday, which was the day I saved his life. I likewise taught him to say master." And that moment, the moment when Robinson Crusoe persuades Friday, the man he calls Friday, to convert to Christianity and to become his servant, is a critical moment and a really illustrative moment in the novel. It shows, it shows a kind of freedom that 18th century British people imagined, right? Robinson Crusoe arrives on the island, and in some sense, when he is shipwrecked, he is absolutely free, right? There's no one there to tell him what to do. There are no constraints that are placed on him. He's no longer a sailor. No one is commanding him to hoist the sails. He is alone. He has absolute autonomy, but he does not have freedom. And it's over the course of the 20 years in the chronology of the novel that Crusoe is marooned on the island that he builds freedom. So he masters, first of all, he domesticates crops. He domesticates goats. He learns the seasons. He studies the Bible. He masters himself. And then eventually he meets this indigenous man and persuades him to become his servant. So he masters himself and he masters someone else. And the irony, the kind of central irony of the novel is that it is in the course of his captivity on a desert island that Robinson Crusoe learns what it means to be free. And that version of freedom, a version of freedom that's based on mastery of nature and mastery of others, and the assumption, even by a kind of modest, rural Englishman like Robinson Crusoe, of the right to command and the right to instruct the non-English world, is essential to the way that people in 18th century Britain understood what it meant to be free. Freedom, often in the 18th century, was distinguished from licentiousness, right? So an Englishman, constrained, commanding, was free, enjoyed English liberty, whereas someone in France, Britain's eternal foil in the 18th century, was licentious. They were less constrained, but also did not have the kind of self-control or the kind of acumen for command that made freedom possible. And so it's kind of telling, actually, that this novel, which, you know, the British Library holds more than 700 different editions of Robinson Crusoe, became a really important text throughout the 18th and 19th, all the way into the 20th centuries. The idea of a desert island with a single English person marooned upon it became a really powerful allegory for writers who were interested, for example, in Robinson Crusoe's money, in thinking about how currency worked within a society. Or in the case of A Supplement to the History of Robinson Crusoe, being a history of Crusonia, which is a book by the very early radical socialist Thomas Spence. Spence imagined what happened after Crusoe left his island, leaving a group of English mutineers left behind on it. Or you could have versions of Robinson Crusoe that focus on Crusoe the scholar, like the one that's edited by an Oxbridge Don in the third image, or ones that explicitly plumbed the moral and religious lessons of the novel. So this was a book that loomed large in the British conscience and loomed large in the British imagination, not only because it was an adventure story, but because it encapsulated in its plot what many Britons thought their relationship was to land, to power, and to the rest of the world. And that idea of what it meant to be free existed in parallel with a growing empire devoted to slavery. So even as Britain profited from slavery in its Caribbean and, before the American Revolution, its Southern American colonies, it was still basing its concept of what it meant, of what freedom was and what it meant to exercise freedom on an idea that was closely allied to the exercise of power over others. So just to kind of summarize this point, and then I'll jump forward into the future, into the 19th century. This idea of freedom in the British Empire was entangled ideologically as well as materially with slavery. So what it meant to be free meant building colonies, controlling land, securing the obedience of other people. That was what it meant to be free. That's why, you know, within 18th century British society, a very small cadre of mostly wealthy, entirely sort of overwhelmingly male and mostly landed people were the people who enjoyed political freedom, for example, because it was nonsensical within the context of 18th century politics to think about freedom as being something that could be exercised by someone who did not already have those constraints on themselves. Defoe's novel Robinson Crusoe is a thriller, but it's also a parable about what it meant to many Britons to be both free and to be civilized, which would become the watchword of the 19th century empire. Freedom had degrees, and it required certain markers of status and certain kinds of behavior: land ownership, mastery, mastery of others, self-restraint. And it implied a civilizing process, something that would become all the more evident when Britain moved towards abolitionism at the end of the 18th century. So the image you can see on this slide is an unfinished portrait of William Wilberforce that hangs in the National Portrait Gallery in London. It's a sketch, in an unfinished sketch, much as my discussion of Robinson Crusoe is a kind of unfinished sketch, and one that I go into greater detail about in the book. But it still suggests the man. And I hope that this discussion still suggests some of the arguments that I explore in greater depth. And it points to a paradox, which is that the British Empire in the 18th century and then the post-abolition British Empire of the 19th century offered freedom, but was built on slavery. And it's that conundrum, that paradox, that's at the heart of the movement to abolish slavery in the 19th century. So 1833, as I'm sure you know, was the moment in which Britain passed the Abolition of Slavery Act, which abolished slavery in Britain's Caribbean colonies, in Mauritius, and in the Cape Colony in South Africa. It was passed in 1833, and it went into effect on the 1st of August, 1834, which was a date actually chosen and dictated by the House of Lords because it was the traditional opening day of the sugar planting season in Britain, which not in Britain, in Britain's Caribbean colonies, which tells you something about the kinds of priorities that British politicians had when they were thinking about emancipation. Emancipation and the policies that enacted it in the Caribbean were policies that were designed to preserve Britain's colonies, preserve Britain's power over the Caribbean, and to preserve the imperial sugar industry. And so I want to take a look I want to take a quick look at what the Emancipation Act actually did. And this might be familiar to some of you, but it's worth reprising. And I'd like to connect it back in the end to the points I made about the 18th century. So the Abolition of Slavery Act provided 20 million pounds in compensation to slaveholders. At the time, this was an astronomical sum, and it was raised with really novel financial instruments for floating loans on the public market. And that was offered as partial compensation to the people who claimed to own enslaved people in the British Empire in order to buy their consent to the 18th century, to the 1833 Emancipation Act, but also to honor the principle of property, right? It wasn't just a kind of massive slaveholding conspiracy that created the compensation fund. There were plenty of anti-slavery MPs in the House of Commons in the early 1830s who thought it only just that a person who claimed to own property in human beings ought to be compensated, not for the fact that they had claimed to own property in human beings, but because they had claimed to own property. And property ownership, as we've seen, and the kinds of constraints and the kinds of powers that it gave to the people who owned it, was a central tenet of what British people thought freedom was. So ironically, in order to preserve British liberty and British freedom, it was necessary to provide, or Parliament deemed it necessary, to compensate the people who claimed to own enslaved people for their putative lost property, right? These, you know, people are not property, but, and many MPs thought so in the 1830s, but nonetheless, the principle of property ownership needed to be protected. And for enslaved people, the transition from slavery to freedom was a very difficult one, marked by a 4-year period of what was called apprenticeship from 1834 until 1838, marked by the division of enslaved people into what were called predial and non-predial workers. That is to say, people who worked in the fields and people who didn't, people who worked in domestic service or who were craftspeople. It required 40.5 hours a week of unpaid labor by predial apprentices for the people who had once claimed to own them. It provided for the appointment of magistrates whose role it was to manage the transition between formerly enslaved people and slaveholders who no longer were permitted to make claims on the bodies of enslaved laborers. It provided for restrictions on movement and regulation of wages for apprentices, and it restricted land ownership and use. And on the one hand, it's easy to look at these regulations and see the sort of a kind of cynical cruelty on the part of the House of Commons. But it's also important to remember that all of these regulations, as you know, on the face of it, cynical and cruel as they were, and as cynically and cruelly as they were administered in the Caribbean, were designed to help recently enslaved people make the transition from slavery to freedom by learning the kinds of forms of self-discipline and wage discipline that 18th century Britons imagined constituted freedom in and of itself. So we shouldn't be surprised or shocked that apprenticeship and compensation were the basic principles of emancipation in the British Empire. But at the same time, we should never lose sight of the fact that the freedom that Britain offered enslaved people in 1833 and 1834 looked very little like the freedom that enslaved people themselves fought for in the course of the 200 years of plantation slavery in the British Empire. And as I emphasize in the book, after emancipation, Britain became an empire that was even more officially devoted to freedom. It became an empire of free trade. It became an empire of free labor. It became an empire that prided itself on the export of freedom to its colonies. But at the same time, the transatlantic slave trade continued. Britain's anti-slavery squadron, which plied the waters off West Africa, was, compared to the scope of the slave trade, minuscule. Britain, although it committed itself to stopping the slave trade, did very little to actually put a stop to it. It was really the end of plantation slavery that stopped the slave trade. Moreover, and more importantly, British industry and British finance capital continued to dominate global trade. So although British citizens or British subjects were forbidden to make a claim on the life of an enslaved person, there was nothing that stopped British investors or British banks from, for example, buying government bonds, buying the debt of the slaveholding states of the American South. So there's one moment in slave empire where I look at the Panic of 1837, a stock market crash in 1837, fueled in part by British fiscal austerity that resulted in effect in British investors in bonds in the American South cashing in on the kind of on a collapse in the global cotton market that also caused enormous misery and distress for enslaved Americans in the United States, despite Britain's official anti-slavery position. And at the same time, Britain continued to consume Cuban and Brazilian sugar produced by enslaved labor, and above all, American cotton. So American cotton produced by enslaved African-American workers was the cornerstone of Britain's free trading empire in the 19th century. But it was, of course, produced by enslaved labor. And this painting, which is a famous and famously bad painting by Benjamin Robert Hayden, it also hangs in the National Portrait Gallery. It's enormous. You can see that's Thomas Clarkson with his finger in the air. Gives a sense of what happened after emancipation. It released an enormous amount of energy into the British reform movements of all kinds, but it wasn't always clear which direction that energy ought to go. So anti-slavery became an all-purpose justification in the British Empire for all kinds of projects of moral or alleged moral reform. Having profited from slavery for 200 years, Britain had enjoyed the kind of commercial and political infrastructure to build an empire in the 19th century. And Britain's imperial power in the 19th century was justified by it having abolished slave trade and slavery. So just to summarize my arguments about anti-slavery and empire, you can see here an image from an iconic work of 19th century adventure literature, a kind of, Henry Morton Stanley's account of Livingston's adventures in Central Africa. In many ways, as much fiction as fact. And it's important to remember that Livingston was in Central Africa on an officially anti-slavery mission, right? So British colonialism in the 19th century drew a great deal of motive force and power from Britain's anti-slavery legacy. And so while the end of slavery in the British Empire was an impressive achievement, the achievement of British abolitionism was more a kind of domestic political achievement, right? There were very powerful interests arrayed against the anti-slavery cause. And so passing laws through Parliament in the 19th century against slavery was an impressive feat of political maneuvering. But at the same time, it's important to remember that anti-slavery wasn't only a British achievement. Enslaved people put abolition on the agenda in many ways, although, as I mentioned earlier, the emancipation that Britain's colonies received in 1833 looked very little like what enslaved rebels fought for in the course of the 18th and 19th centuries. Moreover, the law that ended slavery looked very little like what enslaved people had fought for. Instead, it was conceived of as the beginning of civilization, a kind of different kind of white supremacy. And in fact, that phrase, white supremacy, first appeared in discussions of emancipation in the 1820s and 1830s, or at least as far as I've been able to uncover, right? So that coinage of white supremacy was originally conceived of as a way of explaining how missionaries and colonial administrators could take over for slaveholders in the Caribbean and create a new kind of white supremacy, one that was devoted to building freedom and teaching the kind of freedom that Robinson Crusoe taught Friday in the strange adventures of Robinson Crusoe. And so that's an arc of the book, and that's something that I, if you do get a chance to pick it up and read it, it's something that I discuss in much greater detail. But it's that common thread of civilization, that idea of civilization built during an era when slavery was at the heart of the imperial economy, and then carried over to an era when the British Empire was officially anti-slavery, but still animated by ideas that were deeply entangled and entwined with slavery. That's at the heart of the book. So thanks very much for listening, and I'm very happy to answer any questions you might have. And I'll just leave this slide up with an image of the cover and a bit of shameless self-promotion.
Thank you so much. That was brilliant, and absolutely no problem with the self-promoting your book. As I said at the start, it's great, and I think everybody should go and read it because it changed everything I thought I knew about the empire. I'm going to ask a few questions if that's okay, and please, people, fire questions into the Q&A, anything which comes to mind, and Harriet will ask those on your behalf later. So you mentioned there at the end that the enslavement and the kind of incremental trade which comes as a result of the British involvement in the transatlantic slave trade is really at the heart of the imperial economy and then carries over. And obviously you talk about that in length at your book, or in your book rather. There's an amazing paragraph early on in the book where you talk about what's being imported to Jamaica, whether it's beer and brandy from London, ale, cider, cheese, leather, lime and lead from Bristol, furniture, cutlery from Birmingham and Sheffield, cotton from Lancashire, and so on and so on. It's sort of about that long. And I remember reading it and thinking, flipping heck, absolutely. How important is this kind of web of incidental trade to the British economy at the time that they're involved in enslavement, and also in terms of kind of mobilizing capital, I guess, to reinvest post the abolition? How integral is that incidental trade?
So I think it's first important to preface it by explaining that for the people who claim to own enslaved people, for white slaveholders in the colonial Caribbean and the colonial what became the Southern United States, but especially in the Caribbean, Caribbean slaveholders didn't think of the Caribbean as home, even if most didn't. Even if their families had been there for hundreds of years, they always imagined England as their home. And so, part of the way that that slaveholders presented themselves was as consumers of British luxury goods. But which is one of the reasons why so many things were imported to the Caribbean, right? The litany of products that you described were imported in part because other than sugar, rum, and to a lesser extent other crops like coffee, the Caribbean colonies produce very little else. And so that web of trade drew the Caribbean very close to the mainland British colonies. And in some ways, the trade with the Caribbean was one of the motive forces for the American Revolution, because it was by trading all kinds of stuff with the Caribbean that the colonies, that the 13 mainland colonies that eventually became the United States became economically self-sufficient and independent enough that they could secure their own independence, that they could eventually, fight for their own independence. And so that's part of the story. Another part of the story is the way that the Caribbean, although it was officially, British trade at the time was governed by a series of laws called the Navigation Acts, which officially made it illegal for British colonies to trade with any other party other than British merchants, either from Britain itself or from other British colonies. But in practice, the Caribbean was almost like a kind of slavery-driven free trade zone, where goods that were coming from France's colonies, Spain's colonies, Dutch, the Denmark and the Netherlands colonies were all circulating. So the actual trade in kind of luxury goods to and from the Caribbean was symbolic of the place of the Caribbean within the imperial economy, but it was more the money and the sugar and the rum that was moving from the Caribbean back to Britain that really anchored what I call the slave empire to metropolitan Britain.
Yeah, and I think, again, I'd really encourage people to go and get the book because it explains it so wonderfully. Similarly, in your book, you talk about the kind of impact that European involvement in African, to a degree, pre-existent enslavement has on kind of almost the mechanization, industrialization of African enslavement. Personally, I think that message is so important. Having had lengthy discussions with people, unfortunately, in my family, often, and some friends about, obviously the thing that's said is slavery has existed for thousands of years. It doesn't matter. And actually, I've often found that question quite difficult. But actually, I think your book frames it so well. So whilst you're here, I just wonder if you don't mind talking a little bit about that, because I think it's such an important message for people to hear.
Sure. I mean, I think it's important to note, right, slavery, like the relationships of slavery have existed in human societies for a very, very long time. So slavery existed in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, in the Americas, long before there was a transatlantic slave trade. And long before there was a transatlantic slave trade, there were enslaved people in not all, but in many societies in West Africa. The difference, and this is a difference that historians and anthropologists working on relationships of enslavement in African societies in the past have emphasized. So in a sense, this is not, it's not my argument. It's an argument that I'm trying to sort of make a little bit more comprehensible. Is that in many societies where enslaved people were held in West Africa, slavery was a kind of remote kinship relationship. So an enslaved person might be, for example, a captive taken at war, or someone accused of a crime. But over time, their children might not be enslaved, or their grandchildren might not be enslaved, or as an enslaved person, they might not be exchangeable for money or for other enslaved people. And that's really the distinction between other kinds of slavery and the form of slavery that flourished in the Atlantic economy from the 16th to the 19th century. Because throughout the Atlantic world, an enslaved person was chattel. That is to say, they could always be exchanged for money at any time. They had a price that was that could be determined on a financial market. They were, legally speaking, interchangeable with an object. And that was something very, very different from other kinds of enslavement, particularly in African societies. So when an enslaved person made the passage from West Africa to the Americas, they were, in a sense, entering a new world where their status was, at least legally speaking, identical to any other, to a kind of exchangeable piece of property. And so, you know, and never before in any, you know, I just to kind of summarize the point, a good way to shorthand it is to think, right, there were societies that had slaves, but the Atlantic economies were slave societies. There were societies where enslavement and enslaved labor was a central economic engine of the way the societies functioned. And it was and the position of enslaved people was a central legal precept. Enslaved people were fungible. They were constantly exchangeable for money. And so it was the transatlantic slavery was a distinction both in scope. It was much larger than any other trade in enslaved people in world history, or the kind of global slave trade of the 18th and 19th centuries. And it was also a distinction in kind. It was something very different. I mean, and of course, the important thing to remember is that doesn't excuse slavery in other societies, right? And I think that that's the tricky argument to make when talking about this with students, with other people in conversation, is to say that it's to say that slavery existed in other societies is a way of shifting responsibility away from the ways that a very particular kind of enslavement built the world that we live in, right? And the legacies of Roman slavery are not visible in present day geopolitics or present day economic life, but transatlantic slavery absolutely is. The money that transatlantic slavery earned in the United States, in Britain, in France, is visible in architecture, it's visible in institutions, and that's what's different, I think. But of course, that's a difficult to soundbite kind of answer. So it's a nuanced distinction that requires often more explanation than people who are offering the comparison really want to hear, because what they're trying to do, I think, usually is stop the conversation rather than open it.
Yeah, justification, isn't it? Thank you so much. It's so useful. Last question from me, and then we'll go to the Q&A. And I am going to quote your book, I'm afraid, again, because as I keep on saying, it's wonderful. Go out and buy it, everybody. So you say in your book, and you spoke about this, or began to speak about this a bit earlier. Britain profited from slavery for 200 years, and then used the abolition of slavery to justify nearly 2 more centuries of imperial violence and colonial rule. In an age where we're beginning to look back, I think, in Britain and also kind of countries linked to Britain's colonial past, and try to make sense of, or at least develop a more nuanced argument in relation to empire. And I guess as the inheritors of that past in a way, how might we go about engaging with and teaching about these uncomfortable histories today? Sorry for a difficult question. But,
yeah, I mean, I think one of the keystone, you know, I'm a Canadian living in a post-colonial settler colony of Britons. You know, these are questions that resonate throughout the British and former British world, right? They shape in a way like British imperial. It's impossible to avoid the history of the British Empire, because the history of the 19th century was shaped so profoundly by Britain's empire. And so, despite the fact that it has been dismantled, politically speaking, that doesn't mean that its legacies have been erased. So I think one of the ways to think about the legacies of slavery and enslavement in the present is to think about the way that the money generated by slavery has shaped contemporary institutions, and also to think about the ways that assumptions made in the era of slavery in the British Empire were carried through to the era of freedom, right? So when we think about what it means to be, like, as you know, the theme of my talk, like what it means to be free, what it means to exercise freedom, in many ways, and the historian Thomas Holt, in his book, The Problem of Freedom, frames this really well when he says, you know, we're still living in the 19th century. Our ideas about what it means to be a free person are shaped by British liberalism in incredibly profound ways, in ways that have only kind of accelerated since the 19th century. Like the vision of society as a collection of atomized individuals guided by a set of laws that restrict the kinds of things that they can do remain to this day. So, you know, recognizing the ways that we still, the ways that we think and the things that we do and the institutions that we participate in, and uncovering their past, I think is a useful exercise. It's an eye-opening exercise. And it doesn't necessarily have to, and I think part of the rhetoric, first in the United States and then in Britain, and to a much lesser extent in Canada, right? A lot of the discussion about, for example, reappraising historical monuments or institutions has always been framed as a question of like preservation versus destruction, which I think is a really unproductive way of understanding the way that history shapes our lives, right? Like to paraphrase Marx, right? Man makes his own history, but not in exactly the way that he chooses, right? Where like these institutions shape us in ways that we don't always acknowledge. And one of the tasks of historians and of history teachers and of engaged citizens is to think about how we ended up with the world that we live in, and to uncover things that have been not even necessarily hidden, right? Like that's one of the things that frustrates me sometimes about history, sort of general histories in general, histories written for a general audience, is they always have to be hidden, right? They always need to be the untold story. But these stories are not untold, right? I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pages of accessible, digitally available text from the 19th century that do not hide any of these stories. So it's more, I guess, this is kind of fanciful and sort of hot air in some ways, but understanding that citizenship in the present day requires some kind of understanding of the past. And I think that especially history teachers have that role in teaching people how to be citizens, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's so much there that is important and useful for us as history teachers. And I mean, I'm sure I speak for all the other teachers on here, but I've just had loads of ideas popping into my head about new schemes of work and things and inquiries to teach. So over the course of this evening and based on these questions, so thank you so much. That's it from me. Harriet, can we go to the Q&A?
Sure. So our first question is, how is Britain's anti-slavery rhetoric treated by other European countries who are involved in slavery themselves? And almost like a part two is, was it supported? So two-part question.
So, I mean, I think the abolition of the British slave trade, so it's important first to disaggregate the abolition of the slave trade from the abolition of slavery. And they often get blurred together. And indeed, they were often blurred together by abolitionists themselves, right? And or at least the predominantly white, predominantly wealthy leaders of the anti-slavery movement in Britain in the first 3 decades of the 19th century saw a straight line from 1807 to 1803. And so in some sense, the abolition of the slave trade needs to be understood within the context of the Napoleonic Wars. So this was an era when, one of the things that made the 1807 Slave Trade Act possible was the fact that because of American and French blockades of British shipping, hardly any slave ships owned by British ship owners had actually made the passage from West Africa to the Americas for the past few years before the passage of the Act. So that was proof of concept to British parliamentarians that despite the arguments of Liverpool slave traders that, you know, the slave trade was absolutely central to Britain's economy, it proved that that wasn't the case. And so it's important to see the abolition of the slave trade as a question of British internal, the British regulation of a branch of British commerce. It was entirely internal to the British Empire. And from the perspective of other slave trading countries, at first it was an economic opportunity. You know, the slave trade passed from, you know, the premier slave traders of the 19th century were Portuguese, Brazilian, and Spanish ships, especially Portuguese and Brazilian, in part because although Britain abolished its own slave trade, it could never, despite its stated aspirations to do so, stop the slave trade from every European country. And despite the, you know, even Britain's anti-slavery treaties, which were sort of much lauded in the British press as great achievements of British foreign policy, only applied north of the equator, right? So the slave trade continued throughout the 19th century, you know, not even kind of under the noses of the British anti-slavery squadron, but outside of the world of British regulation. So, you know, in terms of like British anti-slavery as a force for imperialism or as a source of military or as a justification for military intervention really did not affect other countries that were closely involved in either enslaved labor or the slave trade. It was mostly turned against West African polities. So for example, and this is an episode that I discuss in the book, the way that the Nigeria Protectorate eventually passed into from sort of independent West African sovereignty into British colonial rule was through the mechanisms of anti-slavery, right? The British Empire collaborated with, you know, with allies on the ground in West Africa to overthrow the leaders of Lagos and Shell Lagos in the 1860s, and eventually, through the rhetoric of anti-slavery, claimed not only Lagos, but eventually the Nigeria Protectorate. And they did it in part through anti-slavery treaties, right? The anti-slavery treaty backed up by British gunboats was one of the prime instruments of British diplomacy with West African states in the 19th century. So other Europeans, you know, the United States continued to sell Britain cotton until northern blockades of southern ports in the 19th century cut off the cotton supply, causing in fact famine and desperate poverty in Lancashire, the Lancashire cotton famine of the 1860s. And so the British anti-slavery was largely an instrument for advancing colonialism among, you know, the black and brown people of the world, rather than an instrument for intervening in European diplomacy. Yeah, I'm sorry. There was I have a tendency. I think it's because I've been in lockdown here in Ontario to just like talk endlessly. So I feel like I missed the second part of the question. So my apologies. Please, you know, please if I missed anything, please feel free to email me. I have very little else to do these days.
Okay, we have got a couple more questions. Sure. So our next one is, after the Sam Sharp Rebellion, was there a fear that Jamaica would become another Haiti unless slavery was abolished? And then the second part again to this question is, to what extent did the example of Haiti weigh on the minds of the British?
What a great question. Let me start by talking about the Haitian, just sort of answer the question chronologically. So start with the Haitian Revolution and then move to Sam Sharp. So after the Haitian Revolution, it was a very the consequences of the Haitian Revolution were very complicated for the anti-slavery movement, or for the leaders of the anti-slavery movement in Britain. On the one hand, the end of the end of French colonialism in Haiti, in what was French Saint-Domingue, was a tremendous coup for both British statesmen and also for British slaveholders. Because Saint-Domingue sugar before the Haitian Revolution was of a higher quality and produced much more cheaply than British sugar. So it was a major competitor. And so the end of the sugar industry in revolutionary Haiti was, in the short term, advantageous for plantation owners in Britain's colonies. And it was also advantageous for British politicians because Saint-Domingue had been the most valuable colony in the French Empire by a long shot. It was certainly in the 18th century, the most valuable European colony in the world, the jewel of the Antilles, as it was kind of known across Europe. But at the same time, of course, Haiti and Jamaica are extremely close to one another. And there were constant fears that the kind of that revolutionary spirit would pass from Haiti to Jamaica, or from Martinique and Guadeloupe to Jamaica, or that would kind of circulate around the Caribbean. And in that sense, one of the consequences of the Haitian Revolution, ironically, in the British world, or in the British Caribbean world, was the beginning of what was called the amelioration policy, which was a plan that was, in a sense, almost jointly agreed upon by abolitionists and by their opponents in Parliament, the slaveholding interest, to gradually improve the material conditions of life for enslaved people in order to prevent a similar kind of rebellion. And amelioration, I think, cuts to a blindness that was common to both sides of the abolition debate in Parliament, which was the denial that enslaved people had independent politics, right? To British elite abolitionists and to elite slaveholders, the idea that the history of the Haitian Revolution was told as one of privation. Effectively, French slaveholders had been so greedy that they had not treated enslaved people well. They had tried to import too many people from West Africa to Saint-Domingue, and that was the cause of the rebellion. And so the idea was that Britain, because of the kind of self-mastery and very disciplined exercise of freedom that I described in the talk, would take a different path and would slowly improve material conditions for enslaved workers. Now, for abolitionists, the terminus of that process was the end of slavery, sometime in the distant future. For slaveholders, it was the permanent survival of slavery. So amelioration is something that I write a lot about in Slave Empire, and it's a really fraught moment. But the actual, like Toussaint Louverture, for example, was both, the abolitionist James Stephen wrote anonymously a biography of Toussaint Louverture that was written for British working people that treated him as kind of the foil of Napoleon and a hero of the British Empire, in a sense. So it's a complicated, the relationship of the Haitian Revolution, and Henri Christophe, who was the king of the northern part of Haiti after the revolution, was a close associate of Wilberforce. His wife and daughters lived in London. British bankers handled his money. There were lots of relationships between British abolitionists and Haitian intellectuals and statesmen. But the relationship between Haiti and, sorry to perseverate on this, but the relationship between Haiti and Britain was very complicated. And I'll give you one last example, and then I'll talk about the second part about Sam Sharp. Sorry about this. But the interesting thing is that in the course of the 1820s, there was a code of laws passed first by Toussaint Louverture in 1801, and then renewed by various other Haitian politicians after independence in 1804, called first the Code Rural, right, the Rural Code, that required certain that, for example, limited the mobility of Haitian peasants to move from one estate to another if they were working in the sugar industry. And the irony is that all of the revolutionary politics and the transformative power of a Black republic in the Atlantic was invisible to many British abolitionists, but all they could see was this vision of a post-slavery system of laws that seemed rigid enough to control and educate a recently emancipated class of formerly enslaved people. So British abolitionists missed everything revolutionary about Haiti and saw everything about Haitian governments in the first 30 years of the 19th century that was authoritarian, which is a really interesting sort of blind spot in the way that Britain saw the world, and very telling one. So Sam Sharp, and then sorry about this. I know we're driving on, but Sam Sharp, of course, was the leader of the what historians call the Baptist War, the rebellion in Jamaica on the eve of emancipation. And Sam Sharp is a really interesting figure, a national hero of Jamaica. But in many ways, the vision of Sam Sharp that we have, or that that survives is one that comes from the testimony of enslaved rebels and from books written by and letters written by missionaries who knew Sharp personally. And missionaries created in Samuel Sharp a kind of sort of superhuman, super disciplined, almost Christ-like figure. Right, he was, you know, in William Knibb, who is one of the most famous white Baptist missionaries working in Jamaica, described Sharp going to the scaffold when he was condemned to die after the rebellion and exhorting the crowd right before the drop, saying, "Look, listen to your missionary," you know. And in the records of the missionary societies, Sharp is painted as kind of the only member of the core group of revolutionaries who did not believe in violence, right? And did not think that anyone should take up arms, and kind of wept, right, when the first shots were fired in 1831. And that is really telling. And that connects to many of the themes that I've been talking about today, because another part of the mythology of Sam Sharp was that although he was enslaved, the myth written about him by missionaries was that he was brought up in the household of the Sharps, right? So Samuel Sharp was also the name of the person who claimed to own Samuel Sharp, the revolutionary, right? There was Samuel Sharp, the slaveholder, as well. And so it was that experience of growing up effectively in a white household that, in British rhetoric about the Jamaican Revolution, made Sam Sharp into kind of the only figure in Jamaica who was fully deserving of the kind of freedom that white British people were able to exercise. And Sam Sharp's execution at the hands of the colonial government was a kind of sacrifice of this sort of almost messianic figure who prefigured what enslaved people could eventually become if they were to, as you know, as William Knibb had Sam Sharp saying from the scaffold, listen to their missionaries. So I think the history of revolutionary Jamaica once again shows this bifurcation between the politics of enslaved people and the politics that British abolitionists insisted enslaved people have. And the distinction between those two kinds of politics is enormous. And it's something that I think when we're thinking about this period, we always need to be mindful of.
Thank you. Our final question then, I think, is how important was religion in the civilization that the empire promised to its subjects in the 1800s?
Really, really important. Is that, as again, I apologize for perseverating on some of those answers, but critical, but not always in the ways that you would think. You know, there were the anti-slavery movement emerged in, or the white anti-slavery movement, I should call it, because enslaved people were, you know, anti-slavery from the first moment, you know, from within years of the establishment of plantation colonies in the Caribbean. There were major rebellions in Barbados in the 17th century. So the white anti-slavery movement in Britain emerged into power at roughly the same time as the missionary movement. And so the two drew strength from one another. And so, you know, the Anti-Slavery Reporter, which was a magazine, and all of this stuff, one of the, you know, I'm sometimes ambivalent about the way that the internet has penetrated our consciousnesses, our collective consciousness and our individual consciousness. But one of the advantages of living in the internet age is that these primary sources are available to anyone with an internet connection. So the Anti-Slavery Monthly Reporter, this magazine published in the 1820s that was the kind of official voice of anti-slavery in the British Empire, is entirely available online. You can find the whole run easily. And it's full of articles about the admixture of anti-slavery efforts with missionary efforts. And so, yeah, conversion to Christianity was essential to the civilizing, to the vision of civilization, to an extent. But I would say even more important than conversion to Christianity was taking wages, which is not necessarily the answer that everyone expects. But conversion to Christianity was good, I think, from the perspective of people invested in the British civilizing mission, but participating in a wage economy and acquiring all of the kind of forbearance and prudence that having to save to survive instilled in people was in some ways even more important. So there were certain parts of the British Empire where Britain made no efforts to try to convert people to Christianity. Indeed, there were many parts of the empire, in much of the Indian subcontinent, for example, where the Christian missionaries were deeply resented by colonial officials, and in some places barred from entering entirely. So, that wasn't the case in the Caribbean. In the post-emancipation Caribbean, the Baptist Missionary Society, for example, became, in some ways, almost an arm of the Jamaican colonial state. But in other parts of the empire, it wasn't always the case. But throughout the empire, everywhere, civilization was as much a set of economic behaviors as it was a set of religious beliefs. And so, I think it's important to not always see, it's not always the Bible and the gun that Britain comes with. It's sometimes, the pound note and the gun, and the Bible can be swapped out. So I don't want to diminish the role of Christianity in the vision of Victorian Empire, but I also don't want to overprivilege it, because it wasn't always the first line of attack in the British civilizing mission of the 19th century.
Okay, I think we have one final question. So, so this is a request from somebody in our audience. So could you revisit the concept of atonement that you mentioned at the start? Was this addressed by the government, abolitionist literature, and how did the monarchy respond?
Sure. So atonement was a wide, so in some ways I'm borrowing here, and this is one of the ways, I think one of the things that I try to do in my own historical writing is to both write narrative history, but also show some of the ways that historians build arguments in a transparent way. And so the historian Boyd Hilton is really famous for his study of what he called the Age of Atonement, right? He called the era in the 1820s and 1830s the Age of Atonement, an era when a belief in a kind of theological belief in the possibility of instant conversion and instant absolution, which was a belief in a particular kind of evangelical Christianity and evangelical Anglicanism that was in ascendance in Britain in the 1820s and 1830s, passed out of theology into politics. And so, yes, you can absolutely see in, for example, Thomas Clarkson's 2-volume 1808 history of the abolition of the British slave trade, which was published almost like a souvenir volume. It came out, a month after the abolition of the slave trade. So it's clear that Clarkson, and it's 1,200 pages long. So it's clear that Clarkson was writing it for a long time before, he was pretty confident that the abolition of the slave trade would eventually happen, and he had already written the manuscript. He was ready to go. And he explicitly imagines the moment of the passing of the slave trade as this kind of moment of transcendence, of Britain transcending its slave trading past into a kind of more morally upright future. And you can see the same kinds of arguments, especially in 1838 at the end of apprenticeship. There are loads of pamphlets and books and paintings. You may have seen, actually, if you look at BBC or news stories about enslavement and slavery in the British Empire, you'll often see this picture, right? There's an image of a kind of formerly enslaved person who's sort of smiling and holding a chain that's been broken. That painting is not from 1833. That doesn't depict anything that actually happened. That's not, that's an imagining of the moment of the breaking of the chains. There's even a book, Breaking the Chains, Adam Hochschild's popular history of the abolition of the slave trade. So this is everywhere. The image of atonement and the idea of a sudden reversal from sort of evil to good is everywhere. Whether or not it reached the monarchy, I'm not sure. I mean, this is also, George III was, I guess, there are historians who argue about the degree to which George III was invested in the abolition of the slave trade. By the time Victoria was queen, and George IV as well, and William, the monarchy was not a major player in British politics. So I'm not really sure, this was an era of Parliament. And so, Victoria certainly happily wore the raiment of a liberator, right? It clearly like helped to burnish her image. And in speeches in 1834 and 1838, you know, there are, and I quote some of them in Slave Empire, there were moments when people kind of sang hymns of praise to Queen Victoria. And the symbol of Queen Victoria was very, very important to enslaved people, and then to formerly enslaved people after 1837, right? The monarchy itself was symbolically powerful to enslaved people. So throughout the history of the struggle against slavery led by enslaved people, you can see in the 1816 Barbados Rebellion, in the 1823 rebellion in British Guyana, in Jamaica in 1831, enslaved people repeatedly appealed to the crown. They would say, the crown has given us freedom and we're going to fight for it. Colonial slaveholders are keeping it from us. And the degree to which that was instrumental to their politics, or the degree to which that was a kind of genuine monarchism, is really hard to say. But I would say the symbol of the monarchy was more important to atonement than the beliefs of members of the royal family itself.
Okay, thank you very much. That's all of our questions. So Sam, I'll just hand back over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think there's been so much this evening, and thank you ever so much for giving us so much of your time. I'd imagine you ahead in Canada or behind? I can never remember.
It's still the afternoon here, so right. I'm sorry to keep everything. I hope I haven't kept anybody up past their bedtime.
No, not at all. We're still early doors here, but no, that was absolutely fantastic. So thank you so much, and thank you so much for joining us from across the pond in Canada as well. I think last thing really to say, or last things to say, as I mentioned, do go out and buy this book. I cannot recommend it enough. As I keep on pontificating about it, it has changed genuinely everything I thought I knew about the empire. So really go out and get it and read it cover to cover. It's brilliant. And last couple of things for me to mention, please do go on and have a look at our Be Bold History YouTube channel and subscribe. It really is going to help us to grow and do more of this sort of thing. Go and have a look at our blog. There will be another blog post, I promise, Harriet, coming soon. I'm in the middle of writing it. And also do go and follow us on Twitter as well. That's generally where we post any ads for other events coming up. We're constantly in the process of organising future events and things. So please do follow us on there to get more information about that. But last thing really for me to say is thank you so much for this evening on behalf of everybody on this call. It was an absolute tour de force, and I know myself personally, I've had a wonderful time. So thank you so much.
Well, thanks very much for the invitation. It's nice to be able to talk about this in this kind of forum.
No, you're very, very welcome, and thank you so much.